What's really good, everybody? This is Nathan Albach, and welcome to the podcast where we get into people's stories and go down a bunch of rabbit holes about what's really good in the world. Couple quick announcements for those who might be interested. I'm going on Arya Cohen Wade's podcast, Culturally Determined, which is part of the Blogging Heads TV network. If any of you are familiar with that, it's a great network of shows. That should be sometime next week, which I guess might actually be this week for you, depending on when the episode actually comes out. But it should be available either the week of the 15th or the 22nd. So if you follow me on social media, just stay tuned for that. I'm super stoked. We're going to talk about like a lot of the brand Twitter history stuff that I got into in that Vulture article that came out, and who knows what else we'll get into. But yeah, I'm also speaking at a couple conferences coming up, so my schedule might get a little hectic with releasing episodes, but I do have like 5, I think, recorded in the pipeline right now. I'm always behind releasing these things, so they should be coming out in the next couple weeks. They've got some really fascinating guests just around various topics within internet culture, which I know you're all into, so hope you all enjoy it. But yeah, I think that's everything. Anyway, for today's episode, I had the pleasure of speaking with Chris Stokel-Walker. Chris is an internet culture researcher and just expert in general. He's a journalist and a writer he's had work appear in like the BBC and the New York Times and Wired and the Economist and a bunch of fancy schmancy places like that just show you how credible he is. I mean, seriously though, he just put out this acclaimed book titled YouTubers: How YouTube Shook Up TV and Created a New Generation of Stars. So in this conversation, we got into what that book is all about, which I don't want to entirely spoil here, but we touched on a ton of subjects within it, just kind of covering some of the subcultures within YouTube and tracking back a lot of the history of it as a platform, just like when you look at some of the current events that are hot in the media today, how a lot of them, they trace back to the history of the platform. And we also got into just how it's changed over time. You know, like YouTube used to be very like creator focused, and now it's becoming a lot more corporatized, which is leading to a lot of tension in the various subcultures. So got into that. We talked algorithms. We talked about the rise of conspiracy theories online and just a bunch of stuff. So you'll get into it. But yeah, Chris, he's like I said, he's an absolute expert in like YouTube culture and has a ton to say. So I've got links in the show notes to just if you want to like buy the book or if you want to follow him on Twitter. Like his commentary is just tremendous. So please support him. And yeah, I think that's everything. As always, please leave feedback for the show if you dig it. You can find me at Nathan Albach on like any social media platform. So yeah, and review the podcast if you dig it on iTunes or wherever else you listen. Now let's get into what's really good. Chris, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Nathan.
We were just briefly talking before we started recording here. The book that you just put out called YouTubers it seems like such a monumental task that could really take up volumes and volumes of work. So, I mean, how did you go about, I guess, summarizing this entire piece, and like what was the just overall purpose of you writing it?
So, I mean, the whole purpose behind the book was to try and explain to people, some of whom know a little bit about this platform, some of whom know almost nothing about it, just how YouTube ingratiated itself into our society. I mean, we're seeing now an awful lot of headlines around YouTube where people seem to be waking up to its power and kind of recognizing that actually in some ways it's overstepped and in other ways it's really benefited our society. So I think that that was kind of the purpose behind this, is that nobody had done this sort of thing before. There's been a couple of get rich quick off YouTube books that you can pick up, I guess, at airport bookstores. There's been a couple of like officially mandated biographies by Robert Kinkle and Kevin Locker, who are kind of YouTube executives, which unsurprisingly, their conclusion is that YouTube is an unvarnished success and good thing for society. So this was an attempt to kind of, inject a little bit of dose of realism in there. And yeah, it's kind of come out at just the right time. It seems like we are learning more and more about it. And as we record this kind of mid-June, this is literally the US release date, and we are a month out from the UK in terms of that was released back in early May. In terms of like how I narrowed it down, that's the really tough bit, and that's kind of what my editor helped me to do. So I am like super inside baseball when it comes to YouTube, and my editor is a sort of English guy in his 50s who doesn't really know an awful lot about it. And
it's perfect contrast.
Exactly. And so, the first draft of the book was very, very detailed on certain sectors, maybe too detailed in some places for kind of the lay reader. And so Martin, who's my editor and the publisher, he basically said, no, we have to, rather than going super granular on some things, in other ways we have to kind of zoom out and try and get a sense of the scale and the scope of this thing. Because as you say, it's almost impossible to summarize 14 years of the world's biggest video sharing websites in 352 pages. But what early feedback from UK readers and some of the people who have seen it in advance of its publication in the US seems to indicate is that we've kind of got a good mix of stories that are kind of emblematic of how YouTube has changed and where it stands right now, the different kind of power dynamics involved.
Right, yeah, because on one hand, I guess you've got like your mainstream story of YouTube, which, or at least mainstream to me in terms of how I would see it. Maybe this is even insider baseball, but I guess I remember back in maybe 2006, 2007, like right around the time it was starting to pick up steam. Like I remember going on as a kid and watching like viral videos, like the Juggernaut. Or like there was one in the U.S. that went viral called Leprechaun in Mobile, Alabama. You know that one? Where it was like the crazy leprechaun thing, and there was all these like kind of niche things that would just like take off and then they'd go viral, but it was never viral in the sort of centralized sense of the word that we have today, where like now when something goes viral, the entire internet sees it. You can get hundreds of millions, if not billions of people's eyes on something, whereas back then it was kind of this like niche thing. But I guess like, so you could follow that breadcrumb trail, like from those types of videos to then like years later when everybody's parents joined the internet and like you got more videos going viral, like what was the Charlie bit my fingers. You can kind of like follow that trail of like the mainstream viral videos and then to get to this point today. But I think the other side of that coin obviously is the more niche subcultures and how they built the platforms. I mean, I'd imagine it's really hard to choose like which ones of those to emphasize. But like, I mean, for me personally, like where I come at a lot of the stuff on this podcast is kind of political, cultural, and how just internet culture weaves into society in a lot of the ways you kind of hinted at earlier, just where we're seeing the broader cultural effects of a platform like YouTube. So I mean, I'm interested to know, did you emphasize at all in your book the sort of new wave of atheism that hit YouTube in like the mid to late 2000s at all?
Not in terms of specific atheism, in terms of like religion, no. But there's so much that you can cover. Like,
right,
you try and get across like these key moments in YouTube's history, and it can be super hard to do that. I mean, it's really fascinating when you sort of talk about this idea of digital culture, and that's what the podcast focuses on. And I know that you had a lot of people on there, people like Taylor Lorenz and others, and I think that we are at the moment of this really rich, in-depth, internet-based reporting on digital culture. So, like, we're not quite there yet. Like, the crest of the wave is still going up. But people like her, people like Julia Alexander at The Verge, maybe including myself in that, we are, like, of the age where you are kind of as old as you can be to understand this stuff and to kind of be digitally, culturally literate while also having like a role in a media organization or having an outlet like a book publishing deal to be able to try and explain this. Because there is this massive generational gap, as you say. Like, old people don't really get YouTube, or YouTube is very different for them than it is for people who are my age, and then it's very different for people who are like teenagers growing up now.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I think I brought up the atheism example is interesting to me because I can think of like a really tangible, I don't even want to call it like a subcultural movement because it is mainstream in a lot of media, but just this whole like ongoing like free speech culture war thing between the left and the right in like large parts of like Europe and the US, where it's become this debate, I guess you'd say, over free speech, and like lines have been drawn in the sand where there's like political correctness, and there's all these kind of lucrative terms that have been floating around the internet, and I can follow a trail back through YouTube specifically to find some of like the areas where a lot of this terminology and a lot of these cultures started to emerge. And I think, like, for me personally, like we were talking about earlier, like I get into some of this stuff on the show pretty frequently, and it's interesting to think back about like the new atheism movement, how it emerged on YouTube, where you'd see like all these like compilation videos of guys like Sam Harris or Christopher Hitchens, and they'd be doing these debates with Christians or Jews or whoever, and they'd go viral, and it would be like these titles like Christopher Hitchens destroys Christian and whatever, and like that would be the kind of like tag to get people to watch it, like the clickbait. And from there, I realized I was like the early to mid 2000s, that kind of audience in some way, shape, or form morphed itself into what became known as like the skeptic community, which became pretty popular on YouTube. And then the skeptic community, in a way, kind of became this like anti-SJW, like anti-social justice warrior movement, which then like bled into the whole Gamergate movement, which had like massive implications for YouTube as a platform and for all of social media in general. So it's interesting how like you can kind of follow these trails of culture over time through platforms like YouTube and see how from like the mid 2000s to today, like you can actually follow like a trail. And you can do this for any of these subcultures, where you can start at one point and get to today and realize like the actual culture wars that are occurring on the most main staged social media platforms today, and on the and in establishment news, and just in reality, so much of the seeds were sown essentially on those platforms like YouTube way back in the day.
And I mean, it's weird because it essentially requires you to be a digital anthropologist almost. Like, I think that journalism and more generally just the media kind of leads the way on this. You know, we write the first draft of history, and I know as someone reporting on these spaces, I get frustrated at the pace of academics that are covering this sort of stuff, like those online communities, and as you say, tracing back various different movements to their kind of core and figuring out how it ends up where it is. And so it's kind of left to us to be sort of scrappy amateurs and try and identify these things and tell their stories in the best way possible. But yeah, as you say, a lot of this stuff is, they start very, very small acorns, and then suddenly they kind of evolve and they get to be this massive thing. And a lot of the issues that YouTube is facing today, I guess, kind of stem from, you know, decisions that were made or decisions that were not made sort of 5-10 years back.
Well, I'd be interested to get your take getting into the issues that YouTube is facing today. I know just in the past month or so, I don't know how much you followed this whole Steven Crowder debate with Carlos Maza from Vox. Have you followed this at all?
Yeah, it's my job, so I wrote about it.
Perfect.
So, you know, I wrote a story for Wired UK, which kind of explained why YouTube's shift on hate speech as regards sort of Steven Crowder and Carlos Maza was kind of doomed to fail before it started. I mean, you know, we know from Susan Wojcicki's comments at Code Conference earlier this week that, you know, this change had been coming for months. I kind of got tipped off to it, the change in the hate speech policy, before it happened, because it was kind of briefed to European journalists. But YouTube doesn't really like me, which I don't necessarily a bad thing. So they kind of left me out of that email, which is interesting. But I heard about it from somewhere else because I have my sources, which is good, and then started writing about it. And I've been speaking to a lot of early YouTube employees, including some of the people who literally wrote the community guidelines, like the original OG version of it. And it kind of goes back to that idea of like tracking this stuff back. My theory is that a lot of the stuff that we see with YouTube happening now goes back 10 years. And when I try and make this argument to editors and say, well, look, like I need to talk to the person that wrote that original community guidelines to be able to tell you in the best possible way what the deal is now with YouTube's kind of flip-flopping on this and panicking about it. And they don't really get it. And I find that really fascinating because I think there's this very facile, very kind of not very deep coverage of things like YouTube. I think that we still think of it as like this odd little media platform that we can put in a box in a corner without actually anticipating its power and recognizing it. But with incidents like Stephen Crowder and Carlos Matza, those sorts of things start to bleed through into the mainstream. Though, having said that, I did a podcast with The Guardian a couple of weeks back, which is being published shortly. And I mentioned why it was a really good time for them to be publishing it now, given the Stephen Crowder and Carlos Matza thing. And the journalist who was hosting it and was going to be making the final decision on when it runs just basically went, what? She didn't really know what it was, which I find fascinating. Wow. This doesn't bleed through yet.
It's so weird. And a lot of this traces back, in my view, the whole concept of YouTube, in the beginning at least, it seemed like it was almost designed from the get-go as something that was going to kill the gatekeepers to media. Because, up to that point, you essentially had to have some type of platform to television or any kind of media to have a voice. And then all of a sudden, they handed the reins essentially to the masses, and anybody with a phone or a camera could then upload and become a creator and all that. And it's interesting because obviously, like you're talking about, like how the guidelines have kind of been in place and changed over time. It's interesting to think back to that point and thinking about all of the, in a lot of ways, like the horrific content that YouTube has allowed on its platform over time based on this idea that they're a publisher and that, as long as you're not threatening someone else's life or something along those lines, anything kind of goes. But at one point in the past, I don't know, like several years, it seems like so much of that original sentiment that drew a lot of fringe creators and just, I think, creators in general that wanted to do whatever they wanted to the platform, a lot of them started to become more at odds with YouTube as YouTube started to introduce more advertising and trying to become more advertiser friendly. And now they're in this position, we've had the first two adpocalypses, as they've been called, where something happens and essentially advertisers start to pull out of the platform. And like any other business, YouTube, it has to meet a bottom line, and it's built to profit. So, when these advertisers pull out, it creates this vacuum where like they're in panic mode basically, because on one hand they have to appease their creators who are the ones that essentially built the platform for them, and on the other hand they have to appease these advertisers who are paying them to be there. So it's this weird tension that like continues to blur the lines and to piss everybody off, and YouTube is in this position where it's like damned if you do, damned if you don't. So I'd be interested to know like what your take is on that, on like the kind of evolution of how they've added this whole advertiser model and how it's affected the creator model in a way.
Yeah, well, it made them more accountable to essentially standards and practices, didn't it? So yeah, it's interesting because I have this discussion with a lot of people, and they never really give me the same answer, no matter how many people I talk to. But there are different generations of YouTube. Everybody is kind of signed up to that idea that the YouTube that we have now is certainly nothing like the YouTube that we had back when it started, but nobody can decide quite how many generations there have been and when they draw the lines.
Right.
But, a really easy way to divide it, and it's a very, very reductionary one, and it's not one that I agree with in terms of I think there are far more generations of YouTube than this. But we're at a very, very nice time where for 7 years after the site's launch, the motto literally on the front page underneath the logo was broadcast yourself. And then 2012, they get rid of that motto, and suddenly it's no longer this idea of YouTube is a home for kind of unbridled creativity, as you say, taking away the gatekeepers and kind of democratizing the media, reducing those hierarchies and flattening everything. It becomes more like the media that it kind of set out to replace. And that's largely because that's when we started really getting a lot of advertising money coming in. And so we see this in almost everything now. Like, you look at the 2018 Rewind video that YouTube put out, the most hated video.
I was going to ask you about this.
And it's like the first thing that you see when you look at it is Will Smith. And you see him for like 30 seconds at the start. The last thing that you see in that video is Will Smith. And you look at that, compare it to like the 2010 Rewind, which was one of the first sort of formalized ones. And the number of creators has shrunk that they show. And also you start to see way more mainstream celebrities rather than homegrown creators. I mean, the people I speak to an awful lot of creators, an awful lot of people who represent creators. And almost no one is happy with YouTube now, because every public statement that YouTube makes, you can literally sort of parse the sentences and you see their first comments are always to allay advertisers' fears, and creators come second, literally in the sentences.
It really is such a mess. That whole situation, that whole video, the whole YouTube Rewind of this past year is like the quintessential example in my mind of how this tension between YouTube creators and the platform itself is just continuing to divide without being addressed in any meaningful way. And it's put them in this really sticky spot too, because I mean, I don't really know what the answer is in the long term for a lot of these creators, because I would imagine, and you can correct me on this or expand on it, but I think that the biggest, most prominent or influential creators on YouTube have to be gamers, right?
Yeah, I mean, gaming is a massive part of YouTube. I mean, in terms of like the stats, it went from, I think, something like less than 1% of all views in 2006 to something like 1 in 6 or 1 in 8 in 2016, which is, you know, and they are some of the biggest, highest earning creators on the platform, you know, not just in terms of the English speaking world. You know, you have Hola Soy German in Spanish speaking YouTube, who is kind of the equivalent of PewDiePie, and you have like El Rubius OMG in Spanish speaking YouTube. There are massive gaming creators out there, and they are kind of the original ground up creators rather than parachuted in Hollywood celebrities. But the reason why YouTube parachutes in these Hollywood celebrities is because they need kind of like a safe harbor for advertisers. YouTube became massive off the back of individual creators, people like PewDiePie, and then suddenly they realized that PewDiePie is actually problematic because, you know, he says what he wants, and often what he says is relatively unpalatable. So instead they kind of try and downplay the likes of PewDiePie, and they go for, you know, Seth Meyers or Will Smith or whoever.
Right. Or they highlight their more safe creators like Casey Neistat, or even like Jenna Marbles, like just people that they've been with the platform for maybe just as long, if not longer, but they're more palatable to the media and to the mainstream to add a layer to the whole Will Smith narrative, which is just like legitimizing what the platform is and what it looks like and what it feels like to the eyes of the people who we were talking about before that maybe are a little bit more generationally disconnected to what it actually is. The sort of culture, I mean, like it's impossible to define, as you know, I'm sure, like it's impossible to define any one culture of YouTube since it's so amorphous and there's so many subcultures involved. But even like kind of within all those subcultures, and a lot of them interact with one another and they collaborate, and the algorithms kind of trend videos and back and forth between them. But like even looking at it in that amorphous way, I mean, the culture itself of YouTube is just nothing like what the mainstream guys that they're trying to present themselves as. And I know that they're trying to come up with like, YouTube TV, and they're trying to come up with all these mainstream appealing ways to get it in front of more eyeballs, I guess. But I mean, yeah, like what the heart and soul of YouTube is nothing like the guys that they're putting out, which I think is just an ongoing issue. And I don't really see what the solution even is at this point. Like, do you see something that YouTube could do that would kind of mend the situation between the creators who at this point feel disenfranchised by them?
Well, no, because I think that ultimately YouTube is not interested in keeping its creators happy. I think that it's interested in keeping its advertisers happy, and it's kind of got to the point where it's too big to fail. So, had this been the case sort of 10 years ago, where YouTube was much more reliant on a handful of kind of well-respected big-name creators, they could have kicked up a fuss. But now it's kind of like everybody wants to be a YouTuber. The number of people uploading videos to the platform is so great that you kind of have like a ready-made talent pool waiting to replace people who get annoyed. So I think, I do worry that the relationship between creators and YouTube, the entity, is kind of irreparably damaged. And, I don't think that YouTube seems to care that much. I talk to big industry bodies that represent creators, the Internet Creators Guild, for instance, which was set up by Hank and John. Anthony D'Angelo, he is the executive director of the ICG, and their engagement with YouTube is often very positive. But I think in terms of filtering down to the rank and file creators, it's very, very difficult nowadays. And so, particularly when we hear Susan Wojcicki talking about this idea of kind of tiered creator statuses, she kind of mentioned that in the last week, which is the first time that she's kind of spoken about that, the idea that going one step further than the monetization barrier that essentially YouTube introduced maybe sort of 12, 18 months ago, where you had to get a certain amount of watch time and a certain number of subscribers in order to be able to actually be entered into the partner program. I think that we're going to kind of see more multi-streamed YouTube, where you have people who will make money who are set up like professional businesses or are celebrities in their own right. You'll have kind of trusted creators, a very, very small cabal of them that YouTube has worked with for a long time and can trust with advertisers. And then you might have like the free-for-all, everybody else jumping into the pool who won't have the chance to make money, but is kind of just doing it because they want to.
Do you, at this point, see any type of alternative to YouTube coming forth that would essentially appeal a mass amount of these bigger creators that are, again, at one point bottleneck and get so fed up with the platform? Because, I mean, I would imagine, you and I are probably on the same page with thinking that YouTube is a monopoly. Because, there's nothing even remotely close. I mean, I was listening to a podcast recently and someone was saying that, if you don't want to be on YouTube, you can just go to Vimeo or Dailymotion. And there's these other platforms like that you obviously can produce through, but they have nowhere even, fractionally close to the reach and the infrastructure of YouTube. So, I mean, for one, I guess, do you agree with that? And then two, do you view there to be any kind of future where a competitor steps in, or what do you think is going to happen?
Well, look, it's not controversial to say that YouTube is a monopoly in the online video space. I mean, when you have 2 billion monthly active users and you have 50% of the world's population has the internet connection available to access YouTube, and 1.5 billion of those people who have internet connection live in China, which does not have access really to YouTube, you are looking at basically a monopoly there. In terms of people saying, well, go to Vimeo, go to Dailymotion. Well, they've been around for almost as long, if not longer, than YouTube, and they have not yet surpassed it. So I don't quite understand how they would be able to surpass YouTube now, given that it's built up such a head start.
Right.
The only other competitor that could do something possibly, but I don't hold out much hope for it, is Twitch, which has started over the last 6 months, 6 to 9 months, really pushing more of its IRL streams, which is kind of their equivalent of what YouTube is in its most sort of original vlogging format. Now, Twitch has a few interesting things around it. One is obviously owned by Amazon, and as of yet, Amazon has not really paid attention to Twitch. And if they put some more money behind it, they paid time and attention to it, they might be able to build that audience. But you look at the absolute numbers, like Mary Meeker put out her Internet Trends big slide deck earlier this week, and the number of concurrent views, the maximum number of concurrent views for a streamer on Twitch is something like 1 million people, which when you compare it to YouTube is nothing compared to the audience size is just minuscule in comparison. So no, I don't really hold out much hope. I mean, had we been talking about this a year ago or 2 years ago, we might also have said Facebook, but their version of video, like live and watch, has just
tanked.
Yeah, exactly. And this is the thing, like, why would people go anywhere else when YouTube, for all of its flaws, is a really good product?
Yeah, the way that tech platforms have evolved from those early days of like the early to mid 2000s, where it seemed like for about maybe 5 or 10 years there, like every couple years a new platform would kind of eat the last one. Like you jump from Friendster and Zanga and MySpace, and then eventually you get Facebook, and it felt for a while like, oh, we're just going to keep doing this. Like I remember having a MySpace page, and then Facebook kind of took over, and then I remember thinking when I got a Facebook, like, oh, I wonder how long it'll be until like the next thing comes and like takes this over. And then interestingly enough, like of course Instagram came along and that started to blow up, and then Facebook bought it. So it's like this, we're in this like weird time now where like all these corporate entities are they're buying each other. Like, I mean, obviously like Google owns YouTube. And do you think that we're in a time now where part of the problem is that in order to even begin to gain any type of competition or any type of ground or real estate, I should say, in this whole marketplace, that you need one of these megalith corporations just to get started in a way? Do you feel that way?
I mean, we are seeing the maturity of just the online space in general now. People seem to forget that just because mainstream media and mainstream conversation is only talking about these things as if they're new now, they're not. Like YouTube is 14 years old. That's really quite incredibly old for a business, particularly like a Silicon Valley business. And yeah, so they're entrenched. They are kind of stuck there now, and we have a real shift away from this kind of fast-moving Wild West internet to what are established businesses with really pronounced hierarchies and millions, billions, trillions of dollars behind them. So you just can't compete nowadays. But it's interesting, kind of like how YouTube won out. You'll really like chapters 3 and 4 of my book, because I go into the details of like the early skirmishes in the online video wars and the channels and the sort of websites that were YouTube before YouTube. I managed to speak to a guy from Reva, which is like a really old video sharing platform, who is super annoyed about how YouTube won out and has this kind of idea about why it did. And it's kind of the sort of slavish adherence to having anything on there, whether or not it breaches copyright or not, that he thinks really put paid to Reva and made YouTube the number one video sharing platform.
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting. It is crazy thinking back before YouTube and how, every website had to have some kind of embedded video player, like Flash player or something, just so you could watch animated GIFs or videos, and how fast that all changed. And now to look at where we are, it's pretty absurd.
Well, it's interesting. So, this idea of streaming video through a web browser was not necessarily the norm. I have in the book, examples of, there was a video sort of platform set up by an ex-Skype engineer who, wasn't convinced that that would be the way that we would deliver things. So, he was still banking on the idea that you would download like MPEGs and then open them in a sort of dedicated player on your desktop. And it just shows how far these things change and how the internet architecture really shifts in terms of design and also back-end stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't want to put you in any trouble. I don't know if you've published takes on this in the past, but I'd be interested to know, do you believe at this point that a corporation the size of YouTube should be regulated in any way or broken up, like a lot of people are starting to propose, just with the level? I mean, this has been an ongoing conversation politically regarding Facebook, Google, Amazon, like all these larger tech corporations that essentially own these, massive chunks of the market. But YouTube particularly, I mean, it seems like I would say YouTube above the others has the most cultural implications insofar as the way it spreads information and like the amount of people's careers are tied to it, and just like how important it is to cultures all around the world at this point. So, I mean, like, do you personally think that the solution moving forward is to essentially let YouTube do its thing, or do you think that there should be some form of regulation involved?
I think the past 14 years of letting YouTube do its thing might answer that question. Look, I mean, I speak to politicians in the UK, in the US, and in Europe, and have no doubt regulation is coming. Like, it's going to be terrible regulation at first because these are old white dudes that are drawing up legislation and regulation about a platform that they don't know and don't understand. But it's coming, basically. So I got my book somehow got mentioned in a parliamentary debate in the UK. A bunch of YouTube executives were brought up in front of the UK's Digital, Culture, Media and Sports Committee. The fact that digital, culture, media and sports are all kind of combined into one massive homogenous blob will indicate just how bad this regulation might be. Yeah, it is. But so they were quizzing YouTube executives, and they were citing stuff in my book because it poses quite a lot of awkward questions for platforms like YouTube, and they seem to find it really informative. But there was, in this debate, which happened sort of 3 weeks ago, this really interesting discussion and a back and forth between one of the members of this select committee. So it's kind of like a Senate committee for us in the UK. One of those members of Parliament, who is also a lawyer, was arguing with one of the YouTube representatives, who also happened to be a lawyer, over the definition of responsibility, because we know from the last sort of month or two of YouTube's public pronouncements that responsibility is their key watchword. I think if YouTube puts out a public statement that does not include the word responsibility about 5 times, someone in their PR team gets fired, because it seems like it's that common. And there was this debate over what responsibility means, and YouTube were drawing the term responsibility in a very, very precise way. They were saying, we are responsible for our content, but we are absolutely not liable for our content. Whereas the lawmaker was saying responsibility also includes liability. Right. And this is where this debate is going to go in the coming months, is regulation is inevitable. We have white papers, which are kind of like proposals for legislation already going through our UK political system on online harms, it's called. One of which suggests that places like YouTube should make their algorithms transparent, which, if that happens, then UK politicians deserve a pay rise. But this is this really fascinating debate that's going to come up, is there's going to be political pressure for YouTube to take more sort of action, more sort of active action, stepping in on its content. And YouTube absolutely does not want to do that. It's petrified of doing that, I think, because it sort of gets this into a situation which we saw in the last couple of weeks with Stephen Crowder and Carlos Matza, where YouTube has to make really, really difficult decisions about what it stands for and what it will not stand. And that's going to annoy, in the political polarized world that we live in now, 50% of the population, regardless of which way they go.
Right, yeah, because on one hand, you're just going to have, people who fall toward the right end of the spectrum saying that all regulation is bad and that this is essentially a threat to democracy because YouTube, like from the beginning, has represented some form of free speech and kind of breaking, like we were talking about earlier, like kind of breaking down the gatekeepers of media. And now if we're going to regulate that, it's going to get all these voices censored that shouldn't be censored. But I think you put it the way, perfectly when you said, just look at the past, decade plus of how they've handled these situations. And it's just overtly clear at this point that they don't have, whether it's the resources or they don't have the manpower or whatever it is, like they can't handle these one-off, these one-off videos, these one-off situations in any kind of human capacity. And they keep outsourcing it to these algorithms, like with this whole Crowder Mazda situation, where I know there's been several channels that were demonetized and some videos that were taken down that were like just historical videos because they contained like historical like footage or something like that from Nazi Germany and stuff like that. So it's just like the whole thing is just such a dysfunctional ship. And it's interesting because, on one hand, we've been hinting at this whole time that obviously YouTube helped democratize, our information, and it gave a space for creators to essentially build careers and platforms and get their news and their word out, and that's great. But on the other hand, it's also, as we've seen in the past few years especially, it's become this major blow to democracy in a way where we've seen like the rise of flat earth, which has become like massive through YouTube videos. We've seen countless types of conspiracy videos that have spread through the platform specifically. And that's like where a lot of these conspiracies that make their way into the mainstream, they start on like just random YouTube channels, or someone comes out with a title and says, I believe this vaccine is giving kids cancer, and then before long there's 10 videos about it, and then there's 15 actual not credible but people with actual platforms to spread the information. And it becomes this whole weird system where on one hand you have people spreading information, which is great, and it's uncensored, and it's better in most ways. I would argue it's better than mainstream news and establishment news because it's largely free of those restrictions and those agendas. But on the other hand, because it's free of those restrictions, it has no regulations, and these people can just say whatever they want, and it's often completely misconstrued information to be misinformation, which is incredibly harmful to democracy and just society as a whole. So I'd be interested to know kind of where you fit into that conversation and what you think about the past several years as we've devolved into this whole period of misinformation spreading through YouTube.
So, there's at least three things that we need to unpack there, to be honest. So the first thing is kind of how we got into this situation, Nathan. And I, at my most uncharitable, I question whether or not YouTube has kind of spent the last 10 years with its head in the sand, hoping that we wouldn't pay attention to the issues that are now bubbling to the surface, because they are inherently a reactive rather than a proactive company. And anybody who's been watching them for any time will be able to tell you that, even in their sort of response to scandals that keep rising up, they don't seem to have much long-term thinking there. They are focused so much on making this a good experience for advertisers and the business side, and trying to make more and more money from it, serve more adverts against it, and that they haven't really thought through seemingly or don't care about, seemingly, the societal impacts of what is being hosted on the platform. So, you only need to look at the fact that every single scandal that we've seen over the past 2 years from the adpocalypse on has been broken by a journalist. And you have to consider that the quality of the journalism covering YouTube until about 6 months ago from most people was absolutely terrible. It was reductive. So if journalists, traditional journalists, old men who are kind of sitting in offices juggling 5 or 6 different stories alongside this one on YouTube, are able to identify these issues with it, then why on earth wasn't YouTube, with all of its data, all of its staff, all of its Stanford computer science graduates, able to see this in the data and see that this was going to be an issue? So that's one big question that I have, is why are third-party observers better at spotting the issues with YouTube and fighting those fires for YouTube than YouTube itself? And then this is kind of the issue that I think that they have, which is a slightly different one, which is that they are relatively naive to how these things can be gamed. So we've talked about the rise of conspiracy theories, and we've talked about the rise of the alt-right, and how YouTube has in some way contributed to the poisoning of our political discourse. Now, I'm not laying the blame entirely at YouTube's door. I mean, God knows we were becoming really, really politically polarized thanks to Donald Trump. This is just the way that society has evolved. But what YouTube has done is it's kind of been unwilling to engage with the fact that people could be gaming its rules and gaming its algorithm to try and promote extremist content. It doesn't think like a white hat hacker here. It kind of just assumes that everybody will use its platform in the way that it hopes they will, in a very sort of good way. When we look at everything from the New York Times reporting of pedophiles exchanging comments on inappropriate videos, and frankly the algorithm promoting inappropriate videos to people that we believe are probably pedophiles, or things like the rise of conspiracy theories and the fact that YouTube's algorithm prefers the extreme. It doesn't promote paint drying channels, it promotes equivalents of car crashes. And then therefore people will recognize that to get popular on YouTube, they need to produce more and more extreme content. So they start to feed that. And YouTube hasn't recognized that actually people will deliberately game this system to try and gain an advantage. And then the way that they're trying to fix it, the problem basically comes from the fact that they've trusted algorithms over human intervention for too long. And we learn that we can game algorithms probably better than we can humans. We can hoodwink them in a way that we can't hoodwink human beings. So the solution that YouTube proposes to these issues, which is let's throw more processing power at it, is one that has failed. They have tried that multiple times, and we know that it doesn't work. We also know that YouTube is super, super rich. Like Alex Hearn, who is the UK's technology editor for The Guardian, he did some sort of back-of-a-napkin calculations to say, well, why couldn't YouTube actually hire human moderators to look at every single bit of content that's uploaded? And we say 500 hours of content a minute. We say that's a really big number, but we also forget YouTube has an awful lot of money.
Right.
And Alex Hearn said that actually he thinks that they could pay for human moderators to look at stuff, because this is where the issue, the gray area lies for YouTube, is that there is stuff that will not be picked up by the algorithm because it relies on human nuance. It relies on tone and context and things like that, which cold computer logic cannot possibly identify, even if you train it really well. So we do need kind of human moderators to oversee some of these things and to decide on these borderline cases. And YouTube seems to really not want to do that. And I guess it's partly because it thinks that that introduces some element of potential bias from humans. But it's better that we have even just a slightly biased human intervention that can actually pick up on these nuances than cold computer logic that doesn't have a political bias but isn't picking up like 95% of the problems on the platform.
Right, and even the algorithms themselves wind up being biased in some way anyway. I mean, it's sort of inevitable to a certain point. I mean, you're relying on computers to, like you said, dissect, nuance and context in ways that they're not designed to do. So of course, it's going to target various groups across the political spectrum, like essentially victimizing everybody to think that they're being targeted and that it's all against them, and it kind of feeds into this whole conspiracy mindset of people on YouTube and social media in general, which is just that like the platforms are out to get us. And I think you're right. I mean, to a degree, like it's hard to know any of this because obviously, as a corporation, YouTube's about a bottom line and they're trying to sort out like what would essentially better that bottom line in the positive direction for them. So it seems like at this point we need to learn how to push them to the direction of realizing that, hey, more human power behind these accounts would actually, hopefully, positively affect their bottom line, because that's what at least would in some ways salvage part of the platform. And I think you touched on, there's so much you touched on there actually I wanted to get into. Like on one level, I think, like you said, I think a lot of this is just beyond fixing. There's a certain level of just human addiction and like psychology, like when it comes to the rage and the extreme emotional draw to a lot of this content. We see this on every social media platform where, we know that there's people in Silicon Valley just essentially sitting in rooms determining ways to keep you clicking on their platforms. And to a certain point, it's like, how do you curb that? It's like we're seeing like more and more all these techies or these ex-techies coming out of the industry being like, I don't let my kids have smartphones. Like they're coming at it with an awareness to the issues that these things bring. And I know the YouTuber CPG Grey put out a great video years ago at this point called I think it was called "This Video Will Make You Angry." And it was essentially just kind of going in to a lot of like the psychology and like the question of the why, this type of content is so addicting and it gets so many people more activated on social media. And I don't know, because the point you're trying to make is that, YouTube's aware of this and they're essentially feeding into it with their algorithms. Like they're like, oh, this is getting people to look at videos longer, to click more videos. Like we're going to feed into this and keep getting people to stay on our platform by getting them more angry and more emotionally invested in some way, which, man, like that's one area in this whole thing where I don't know how you can solve that without some kind of regulatory intervention, because it just seems like if it's going to continue to further their bottom line, I don't see why they'd have any motivation to stop feeding those algorithms.
Yeah, well, it's kind of like Frankenstein's monster in a way. Like, I wouldn't want to be a YouTube executive because I think that you have a massive headache at the minute where if you had acted 5 years ago in a kind of politically more welcoming climate, you might have got away with it, whether or not that acting is you proactively trying to do something to curb the biggest excesses in terms of polarization and pretty horrific debates and this kind of race to the bottom for the mainstream of YouTube that we've seen, or whether it's kind of, fessing up and saying, yeah, you know what, we don't have a handle on this, we need some sort of outside regulation. But they're now kind of in too deep, and it's kind of either they go up or they go down, and either way it's going to end up badly for them. But, we should say that, YouTube is admittedly a hell site, but it is also kind of brilliant at the same time. Like, we always focus on this because it is of such importance. But, like, there are so many people still doing amazing creative things on the platform. It's not just Stephen Crowder and PewDiePie shouting at each other.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty key to point out in a discussion where we're talking about the problems of this, negativity, to just be like, okay, this isn't the only thing going on here. Because I mean, I go to YouTube more so than anything else, other than probably podcasts. I mean, they might be neck and neck for where I go to get like certain news and certain just like niche forms of entertainment and information. And I'm sure you have a similar trajectory to yourself, but like I can look back over the past, probably 6 years, I want to say, that I've been going to YouTube, at least in some capacity, for information, and just to kind of watch my own personal progression into like who I thought was credible or who I thought was, providing some kind of value to my life. And I look back and I'm like, oh my God, like I can't believe I watched that guy, or I can't believe I thought what this person was saying was accurate. And it's just interesting, like how, at this point, and now at least maybe 5 years from now, I'll still look back and be like, what an idiot. But at this point, at least, I feel like I'm in a better place insofar as, being able to judge for myself and interpret information as it comes and misinformation as it comes, and where to draw lines between somebody pontificating their 2 cents on something and then actual like journalist reporting when it comes to that. But I think you made a good point earlier too, just talking about how we're in this. You didn't explicitly say this, but I know you were hinting at it, like just how we're in this kind of weird climate where people from both the left and the right, I would say probably it's split with a majority on the right, but people are just so fed up with establishment media and journalism that there's this like disdain in a way for journalists and for media, and that's why you have this like the surge of people going to YouTube and podcasts and all these alternative sources to get their information. And the problem with that, like you said before, is that they don't have the same skills, at least in the traditional sense of like backing their, their facts and their sources. Where on YouTube, this is the one thing that I just go on about when it comes to, creators that I follow who I think are largely doing fantastic work, and I can fact check them myself and be like, oh, like this is, largely a true thing. But the one thing about most creators on YouTube who might still be doing great work is that almost none of them include sources in what they're saying. So, I mean, like, unlike a newspaper or even like in most cases with like online articles or studies, when you're looking up information, with YouTube, you have someone who's preaching stats at you or preaching their rhetoric about some type of event. And when you go down to like the like more info tab or whatever, in a lot of cases you're not getting any substantiated links or information, which is just a massive problem with the way the platform's developed in terms of how, especially younger kids, because like I said, for someone like me, I can at least interpret it at this point in my life and be like, okay, I should fact check this. But for kids who are like 12, 13, 14, 15 years old, they're going to this, and that's just essentially how they're being programmed to receive information, which is a very poor way, I think, when it comes to like the levels of journalistic standards.
And this is a really concerning thing, is that the demographics work against us here. There is a massive media literacy problem in that a lot of the kind of news sources that we seem to see becoming so popular on YouTube are not well fact-checked, are not well resourced, are not really that beholden to the truth. And we see them kind of replacing the old standards of media, the CNNs, the BBCs, the wherevers. And that's fine, provided that they introduce rigor and standards, but they often don't. And as more and more young people turn to YouTube for news, I mean, young people now don't read newspapers, they don't visit newspaper websites, they don't watch TV news, they go to YouTube, which is fine if this is legitimate information, but it's often not. And this is one issue that is massive. And then there's kind of a little bit of a tangential one, which I think it's important to touch on as well, which is YouTube gets very defensive about the negative media coverage it's getting in the mainstream media, which almost borders on kind of like conspiracy theory. Mm-hmm. They kind of think that the mainstream media is out on like a sort of smear tactic to try and discredit YouTube because they're threatened by it. And Susan Wojcicki kind of hinted at this at the Code conference this week, where she said that a lot of the news and the concerns and the stories around YouTube have been about a sort of fractional 1% of users that are uploading troublesome content, and that we tend to ignore the 99% of other people who are, uploading either interesting content or educational content or anything like that. Now, I disagree with that on a couple of fronts. I agree that a lot of traditional media, because they don't look at YouTube in depth, tends to focus on the scandals. But there are a lot of us out there who are doing good reporting on, enterprise on YouTube, on education on YouTube, on all sorts. I've covered my fair share of stories about that. I'm quite even-handed with YouTube coverage, I think. But there is a kind of more fundamental issue around that, which is that it's super disingenuous to say, well, it's only 1% of our users that are causing the problems, so why does the media fixate on them? Because it overlooks the fact that those 1% of users have an outsized impact in terms of views and in terms of leading the conversation. So that's why we talk about this, and that's why we cover it, is that this is really a threat to society.
Yeah, I think that is a major issue to highlight. I forget who put it together, but somebody put together this mapping of political YouTube, essentially, and it showed it was kind of like a web in a way, where it showed like left, center, right, roughly, and it showed how they kind of all connect and which channels are the biggest and whatnot. And when you look at the most influential, largest channels that have the most reach and the most cross-pollination to other parts of YouTube, it's almost always either conspiratorial or fringe or extremist, and you just don't realize it until you start to look at the way the algorithm pits these channels together and how they all kind of funnel in to each other with information. And I think that's what's so scary about it, I think, is because you can start maybe with a fairly innocuous channel that maybe is just entertainment with politics sprinkled in some form, but then that channel is related to this other channel which is explicitly political, and then that channel is related explicitly to this conspiracy channel. And when you look at the numbers, the views that some of these videos get, some of them are in the hundreds of thousands of views, some of them are in the millions of views, and it's just so indicative, I think, of just this disconnect that we're talking about, where there's this failure to really, and not just on YouTube's part, but the general public, people in general just aren't really understanding the reach and the influence of some of these problematic channels. And what we do with that is so important, because I think you and I would agree, in terms of what would be considered mainstream political discourse, there was the whole abolishment of the fairness doctrine in 1987 in the U.S., which was essentially this doctrine in place that was anytime you present controversial news on television or in a newspaper, you have to basically demonstrate that you're representing both sides of that issue in some way. And when that was abolished, you look at the way news covers this type of stuff. People essentially can do what they want, hence a lot of these more fringe opinion shows on somewhere like Fox News now. But also I think it's important to realize the mainstream voices, whether it's New York Times or The Atlantic or wherever these publications fall, you're not seeing this equalized positioning where you have a far right conspiracy theorist who believes that Jews are controlling the media and that it's all all the media is against white people or whatever it might be. You don't have that guy, and then on the other side is a panelist of someone who's that's wrong, and basically trying to debunk it. You don't in what we consider establishment media, you're not presenting both of these as essentially the same weight and the same credibility, because that essentially just gives credence to that extreme view. And I think that's largely a part of the problem on YouTube, is that there's no way for the viewer, especially we're talking about these younger viewers, to determine what's credible and what has factual reporting or backed information, because it's all just out there. So when these fringe channels continue to grow and cross-pollinate, yeah, it might be this small fraction of the total creators, but you're saying, the reach of it and the influence of it has massive consequences to society and democracy, like we've been saying.
I mean, you look at the sheer number of channels that have millions of viewers. It's something like 5,000 plus channels have more than 2 million subscribers. That has more reach than most countries' TV channels. Talking about 2 million people in the same place potentially watching those videos. Like, this is a real force to be reckoned with, and this is why I'm so happy in a way that the book comes out right now, is that we seem to be finally slowly waking up to this idea that this thing is big and we need to understand it better. And for a long time we haven't. So the book is kind of an attempt to explain that to people who either don't really know or who think they know and might want to learn a little bit more about it. Because if we don't start thinking about this thing more critically, we could end up in a really difficult place.
Yeah, I think it's fantastic, man. Like I said before, I really just admire and appreciate you putting in the time and the hustle to really get this thing done in such like an all-encompassing way. Because it's one of those things where whether I'm talking to my wife or my coworkers or friends or the parents of my friends, there's a level of partially a generational disconnect, but then there's also even just a level of people that might be you or I's age or a little younger, and they're just not paying attention to the platform. So when these people who are a little bit removed from what like the inner workings of YouTube are doing, when they approach the platform, they're so much more susceptible to all these problems that we're talking about in a way, because they're not versed in essentially like what you and I maybe are a little bit more obsessive and know a lot more of the history and can like gauge the credibility of a channel and like where it came from and how its associations fit in with the whole bigger picture. And if someone from the outside who's not really that savvy or that involved with YouTube approaches the platform and just starts like going down a rabbit hole of the algorithm and just starts getting suggested videos and just going place to place, it isn't long at all before people get radicalized or they get put in these positions where they're now believing that we never landed on the moon or that the earth is flat or whatever it might be. And it's like, it's not this far off thing that I think we've expected it to be in years past, where you see it becomes like a meme essentially, where it's like, oh, like flat earth or anti-vax or whatever, like all these crazy conspiracy people, right? But like now we're starting to realize, wait, no, like these aren't all crazy conspiracy people. Like this is actually a growing movement, and it has bones to it, and it has power and influence, and like we have to start taking it seriously, because if we don't take it seriously or we don't address it in some way, it's just going to continue growing. And at this point, like you've been mentioning throughout, YouTube has just essentially done nothing to curb a lot of these growing, extremist groups and these fringe ideologies and ideas that have essentially rebirthed themselves through YouTube almost exclusively as a platform.
And this is, what is quite so important is that we need to have a conversation about this thing. And I think that, the book is in many ways a conversation starter. Like, it poses some pretty key questions about how we let this thing into our lives and where it could go in the future and what it could mean for everything that we do and how we live our lives. And, it kind of tracks all of that back and asks people, well, what kind of discussions do we want to have around YouTube in the future? What kind of things do we need to worry about and do we not need to worry about? And that's kind of what I'm hoping it'll start, is a kind of new conversation about YouTube that is maybe a little bit more mature and a little bit more thoughtful.
Yeah, I hope so too, man. And I'll this has been a great conversation, and I'll leave you with this, because throughout once you brought up some of the stuff regarding like Parliament and you being referenced in some of these court cases, do you have any just regarding this big picture stuff? Because I know you're obviously working as a journalist and you're doing interviews and you're reporting on this whole subject matter, but in the future, do you have any intention of getting involved at the regulatory level or like consulting these people that work within YouTube or maybe some of the corporations that or the governments that are surrounding this whole situation?
I mean, if they want to get in touch, then sure, but a lot of it is kind of, I can add and expand on stuff till the cows come home. This is kind of my life now, is watching and observing and looking at YouTube and its impact. But, I kind of like being the impartial observer, but if they ever want to call me for advice, then they know where I am. I've contacted them before in the past about requests for interviews and things like that. Still haven't got that Susan Wojcicki interview yet, which I'm waiting for. That'll be really fun when that happens.
Awesome, man. Yeah, well, like I said, I really, really appreciate the work that you do and the eloquence you bring to these issues, where you're able to like bridge this divide between the people who are savvy to the platform and the people that are new to the platform. And I think it's just so important for the time that we live in. And I'll make sure I have links to where people can buy your book and all that. But do you have anything you wanted to add at the end, like anywhere you want people to follow you?
They can always follow me on Twitter, where I will just have occasional 280 character primal screams against the world and against YouTube sometimes as well.
Perfect. All right, Chris. Well, thanks so much again for the time, and I'll talk to you back on Twitter, and I'll be enjoying those primordial screams into the abyss.
Likewise. Thanks so much, Nathan.
Of course. Take care.